In this video, we continue our discussion on Chapter 7, where last time we developed the short-run aggregate supply curve in our ADAS model. This time we will develop the aggregate demand curve by considering the curve itself in order to discuss its slope as well as determinants, from which we will conclude with the summary. With all this in mind, beginning with our preliminaries, currently we are developing the ADAS and Phillips curve models in order to convey our story of business cycles, where thus far we are underway with our development of the ADAS model, which we mentioned was a representation of the aggregate product market of an economy, and in terms of this model's components, we have developed the long-run aggregate supply curve, which represents potential real GDP, as well as the short-run aggregate supply curve, which represents selling behavior by firms in the economy. Now we'd like to conclude our discussion on the component aspect of our model by developing the aggregate demand curve, where the aggregate demand curve represents the real GDP level agents are demanding at alternative price levels in a given time period, holding all else fixed, where our agent types will be consumers, firms, the government, as well as foreign agents, where, considering our aggregate demand curve, we see that the price levels on the vertical axis and quantity of real GDP is on the horizontal axis, and in terms of our curve itself, we see that it's this downward sloping curve here in blue. Now, the reason why the aggregate demand curve slopes downwards, or that there's a negative relationship between the price level and quantity demanded in terms of real GDP, will be attributed to the real balance, interest rate, and foreign trade effects, where, beginning with the real balance effect, and starting with our graph on the left, in which we'll be assuming the price level P0 and the quantity level Y0 with respect to real GDP corresponding to point A. In terms of the real balance effect, agents in the economy will have wealth, where wealth is going to be the sum of income as well as agent asset holdings. Now, should the price level in the economy increase from P0 to P1 and holding agent wealth fixed? Well, with the price level increasing, then that means the ability to make purchases has decreased, where with demand corresponding to both ability and willingness, with ability decreasing, this then corresponds to a decrease in quantity demanded with respect to real GDP, in that agents can now afford to purchase less, given they have less of their resource in terms of real purchasing power. So then this corresponds to going from Y0 to Y1 in terms of real GDP, leading us to point B, where we see going from point A to point B, there's a negative relationship between the price level and quantity demanded with respect to real GDP, and that the price level increased, and quantity level with respect to real GDP decreased. Now, moving on to our interest rate effect, and starting at point A once again on our left graph, at the price level P0, and at the quantity level Y0 with respect to real GDP. What the going interest rate is in the economy will have an effect in terms of quantity demanded with respect to real GDP. In that, should the price level increase from P0 to P1, as we've seen before when we were discussing the real balance effect, well, this will alter the amount that consumers will need in terms to make their purchases, and that they will need more money. By needing more money, this will correspond to an increase in money demand, where with money demand increasing, this will drive up interest rates, where interest rates are the cost to borrow, where with a higher interest rate, this then corresponds to disincentivizing agent borrowing in the economy, where with decreased borrowing going on in the economy, this will correspond to a decrease in quantity demand with respect to real GDP, moving us from Y0 to Y1, which will lead us back to point B on our aggregate demand curve, where once again we see that the price level increased, and we see quantity demanded with respect to real GDP decreased, or in other words, there's that negative relationship between the price level and quantity demanded in terms of real GDP. Now, lastly, we have the foreign trade effect. How the domestic price level of a domestic economy compares to the price level of a foreign economy, or the foreign price level, will have an effect in terms of what agents are doing as well. So, considering two economies, and assuming that the graph on the left and the right corresponds to the domestic economy, we have the domestic price level on the vertical axis, and we have domestic real GDP on the horizontal axis. And we're assuming the price level P0 for our domestic economy, and we are assuming quantity demanded at real GDP corresponding to point A. Now, should the price level of the domestic economy increase from P0 to P1, in which this domestic price level is now strictly greater than the price level of the foreign economy, then this will incentivize domestic and foreign agents to decrease what they're purchasing in this domestic economy and move over to making purchases in that foreign economy. When this happens, this then corresponds to a reduction in quantity demanded with respect to domestic real GDP in our economy, corresponding to movement from Y0 to Y1, in which will lead back to point B, where once again, going from point A to point B, the price level increased, which then was met with a decrease in quantity demand with respect to real GDP, or that there's a negative relationship between the price level and quantity demand with respect to real GDP. So given the real balance, interest rate, and foreign trade effects are why the aggregate demand curve slopes downwards. Now moving on to determinants, the aggregate demand curve represents demand in terms of real GDP by agents. This means that the aggregate demand curve is determined by agent expenditures, or in other words, consumption, investment, government purchases, and net exports, which we see are the components of the GDP decomposition as we've seen in Chapter 5, which means we also know that these components are pro-cyclical, in that if one of these factors increase, we would expect GDP to be increasing and vice versa. So with this in mind, let us see how a change in one of these agent expenditures will correspond to a change in our aggregate demand curve. We will consider a positive and a negative change, in which first we'll consider a positive change, where for our example, let us say that firm investment has increased. Well, starting with our graph on the left, price level on the vertical, quantity of real GDP on the horizontal, we have our downward sloping aggregate demand curve, and we're assuming a price level P0 at a quantity level of Y0 with respect to real GDP, leading us to point A. Well, if firm investment increases, this would correspond to an increase in real GDP, where with an increase in real GDP, this would correspond to a rightward shift in the aggregate demand curve, taking us from aggregate demand in blue to aggregate demand 1 in purple, where at all price levels, quantity demanded with respect to real GDP has increased, where assuming our original price level P0, this then means rightward movement from aggregate demand on point A to aggregate demand 1 in purple at point B, where the quantity level with respect to real GDP demanded is Y1, which we see is a strict increase from Y0. So, having seen a positive change, let us now go on to a negative change. In this case, if should there be a decrease in firm investment, let us see what occurs. So, same as before, we're assuming that we're on our graph on the left, price level on the vertical, quantity of real GDP on the horizontal. We're at our original aggregate demand curve, downward sloping in blue, at the price level P0, and the quantity level Y0 with respect to real GDP at point A. Now, if firm investment decreases, this would correspond to a decrease in real GDP, where with a decrease in real GDP, this would correspond to a leftward shift in aggregate demand, taking us from aggregate demand in blue to aggregate demand 1 in purple, where at all price levels, quantity demanded with respect to real GDP has decreased, where assuming our original price level P0, this then corresponds to leftward movement from point A on AD in blue to AD1 in purple at point B, where in terms of the quantity level demanded with respect to real GDP, this corresponds to Y1, which we see is a decrease compared to Y0 as required. To summarize our findings of the aggregate demand curve then, the aggregate demand curve represents agent demand in terms of real GDP, in which there's a negative relationship between the price level and quantity demanded with respect to real GDP, which we attributed to the real balance, interest rate, and foreign trade effects. And in terms of its determinants, aggregate demand is determined by consumption, investment, government purchases, and net exports, or in other words, the components of the GDP decomposition, in which we've seen the components of the GDP decomposition are all pro-cyclical, and that if there's an increase in one, we would expect an increase in real GDP, which would correspond to a rightward shift in aggregate demand, whereas if there is a decrease in one, this would correspond to a reduction in real GDP, which would then correspond to a leftward shift in aggregate demand. With all this in mind, we'll pick up next time by developing the equilibrium concept in the ADAS model.